They called it the Kudzu graveyard. Oconee County spent $50,000 trying to burn, poison, and bulldoze the 40-acre nightmare, eventually surrendering it to tax auction. When Sadie Gallagher bought it for a song, they laughed. But her goats didn't just clear the land. They unearthed a county secret. The auctioneer's gavel hit the block with a hollow thud that echoed through the stifling Oconee County courthouse. Sadie Gallagher stood at the back of the room, her hands sweating, clutching a cashier's check for $12,000. That was all it took to buy 40 acres of prime Georgia real estate. It was a steal. It was also a death sentence. In Oconee, Tract 73 wasn't known as farmland. It was known as the Kudzu graveyard. For 3 decades, the invasive Japanese vine, often dubbed the vine that ate the South, had swallowed the property whole. It wasn't just a ground cover, it was a biological monster. The Kudzu had grown into a solid green ocean, climbing 60-foot pine trees and dragging them to the earth with the sheer weight of its foliage. It draped over the topography like a thick, suffocating blanket, hiding whatever ravines, rocks, or dangers lay beneath. The county had seized the property for back taxes 5 years prior and immediately tried to flip it to commercial developers. But there was a catch. Before anyone could build, the land had to be surveyed, and no surveyor on earth was going into that impenetrable jungle. The county brought in heavy machinery, 2 bulldozers through their tracks, hopelessly tangled in vines as thick as a man's forearm. They tried chemical defoliants, but the EPA stepped in when the heavy runoff threatened the nearby Oconee River watershed. They even tried a controlled burn, which nearly took out the neighboring subdivision when the fire crowned in the dead pines trapped beneath the vines. Defeated, bleeding money, and facing public mockery, the county threw Tract 73 back to the auction block. When Sadie raised her numbered paddle, the room went dead silent. Then snickers rippled through the gallery. Arthur Pendleton, the county's chief of zoning and land management, leaned against the back wall of the courthouse, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Arthur was a man who wore his authority like a cheap, heavy cologne. "You just bought yourself a 40-acre citation, Miss Gallagher," Arthur said, pushing himself off the wall and ambling over to her as the crowd dispersed. "County Code Section 411, nuisance vegetation. We gave the county an exemption while we owned it, but as a private citizen, you have exactly 60 days to clear the 300 feet of frontage along Highway 9, or we fine you $500 a day." Sadie folded her receipt and slid it into her denim jacket. She had sunk her entire life savings into this land. After losing her family's leased farm in Tennessee to a corporate buyout, she was desperate, but she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what she was buying. "I know the code, Mr. Pendleton," Sadie said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline shaking her core. "And I have an eradication plan." Arthur chuckled, a wet, condescending sound. "An eradication plan? Right. We threw 50 grand and a fleet of John Deeres at that land, and the Kudzu just spit them out. What are you gonna do? Wish it away?" "I'm gonna eat it," Sadie replied. 2 days later, an 18-wheeler livestock hauler backed up to the rusted, vine-choked perimeter gate of Tract 73. Arthur Pendleton was parked across the highway in his county cruiser, holding a clipboard and a cup of coffee, waiting for the circus to begin. He watched in bewilderment as Sadie dropped the trailer ramp. Out poured a living, breathing, bleeding army. 150 Kiko and Boer crossbred goats flooded the pavement, their hooves clattering like a hailstorm. Leading them was Goliath, a massive 200-pound spotted wether with horns that swept back over his skull like scimitars. Goats are not sheep. Sheep eat grass, keeping their heads down. Goats are browsers. They eat brush, leaves, brambles, and vines, keeping their heads up. And if there is one thing a goat loves more than anything else on planet Earth, it is the high-protein, sweet-tasting leaves of the Kudzu vine. Sadie didn't hire heavy machinery. She brought a biological weapon. With the help of Wyatt Jenkins, a rugged, quiet neighboring farmer who had taken pity on the crazy goat lady, Sadie had spent the previous 48 hours hacking a tiny 6-foot clearing along the fence line just to set up her equipment. She pounded step-in fiberglass posts into the hard red Georgia clay and strung up electronet fencing, connecting it to a humming solar energizer. "You think they can actually dent this?" Wyatt asked, wiping sweat from his brow as he looked out at the 40 acres. The kudzu was so thick it looked like a green glacier rolling over the hills. "Watch," Sadie said. She opened the staging pen. Goliath stepped forward, sniffed the air, and let out a low grumble. He took a bite of a broad green kudzu leaf, then another. Within seconds, the entire herd realized they had been released into an all-you-can-eat buffet. The sound of 150 goats chewing simultaneously was surreal. It sounded like a heavy rainstorm hitting a tin roof. Arthur Pendleton rolled down his window, his smug smile fading. He picked up his radio. Sadie's 60-day countdown had officially begun, but Arthur already had a sick feeling that this stubborn woman might actually pull it off. He couldn't let that happen. Tract 73 was supposed to default back to the county, but this time with a specific buyer waiting in the wings, a commercial developer who was heavily funding Arthur's upcoming campaign for county commissioner. Sadie Gallagher was not part of the plan. The first 2 weeks were a grueling war of attrition. Sadie lived in a rusted Airstream trailer parked on the narrow gravel shoulder of the highway, practically sleeping, with one eye open. Managing a targeted grazing operation was not a matter of simply letting the animals loose. If left to their own devices, the goats would wander, eating a little here and a little there. To decimate the kudzu, Sadie had to use intensive rotational grazing. She and Wyatt fenced the goats into tight quarter-acre paddocks. The goats were forced to eat every single leaf, stem, and crown of the kudzu before she would move the fence to the next section. By stripping the leaves, the goats starved the deep, tuberous roots of the kudzu of photosynthesis. Without the leaves to harness the sun, the massive taproots, some the size of human torsos, began to slowly die. But the land fought back, and so did Arthur. On day 14, Sadie woke up at 3:00 a.m. to the frantic barking of her Great Pyrenees livestock guardian dog, Barnaby. She grabbed her flashlight and sprinted out of the Airstream into the muggy Georgia night. The solar energizer was dead. The electro-net fencing hadn't just shorted out. It had been cleanly snipped with wire cutters. A dozen goats had spilled onto the highway shoulder. If a semi-truck came barreling down the road, it would be a massacre. Worse, it would give Arthur Pendleton the exact legal leverage he needed to impound her herd for public endangerment and condemn the property. Heart pounding in her throat, Sadie shook a bucket of sweet feed, her hands trembling. "Here, boys, come on, girls," she called, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Barnaby expertly flanked the escapees, gently nudging them back toward the gap in the fence. It took an agonizing 45 minutes in the dark, but they got the animals secured. The next morning, Sadie inspected the cut wire. It was a perfectly clean, angled snip. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her. Later that afternoon, Arthur's white county SUV rolled up to her trailer. He stepped out, looking overly casual. "Just doing a spot check, Miss Gallagher. Hear you had some containment issues last night. A neighbor called in a noise complaint. Something about goats on the highway." Sadie glared at him, her jaw set. "My animals are secure, Arthur, and there are no neighbors within 2 miles of this stretch of road. So unless you were out here taking a midnight stroll with wire cutters, I'd suggest you find something better to do with your time." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "So you've got 46 days left, Sadie. The kudzu looks exactly the same to me." He tipped his hat and drove off. But Arthur was lying. The landscape was drastically changing. By day 30, the wall of green along the highway had been transformed into a stark, skeletal landscape of brown, leafless vines. The goats had stripped the frontage completely bare, exposing the rusted remains of an old tractor, piles of decayed tires, and the undulating, uneven earth that had been hidden for decades. As Sadie pushed the paddocks deeper into the property, the terrain grew treacherous. The center of Tract 73 was a steep, plunging ravine that the county bulldozers had entirely avoided for fear of rolling over. The kudzu here was ancient, the vines thick as python snakes, draping over massive, mysterious mounds in the center of the depression. On day 41, the temperature spiked to 98 degrees. Sadie and Wyatt were down in the ravine, sweating through their shirts, dragging a heavy roll of netting to enclose the largest mound. The goats were aggressively attacking the vines here, driven by a voracious appetite. "Look at Goliath," Wyatt said, pointing to the alpha wether. Goliath was standing on his hind legs, leaning against what looked like a steep green hill, ripping down a curtain of vines. But as the foliage tore away, a strange sound echoed. Not the soft thud of hooves against dirt, but a sharp, hollow clack. Hooves against stone. Sadie frowned and walked closer, pushing her way through the bleeding herd. She grabbed a thick stalk of kudzu and pulled with all her weight. A massive sheet of the vine tore away from the hillside, snapping and kicking up a cloud of choking dust. When the dust settled, Sadie stopped breathing. It wasn't a hill, it was a roof. Specifically, it was a slanted slate roof. Beneath it, exposed by the goats' relentless chewing, was a perfectly squared chimney made of hand-hewn river stone. "Wyatt," Sadie gasped, stepping back, "bring the machete." For the next 3 hours, they didn't manage the goats. They became archaeologists, hacking, chopping, and tearing away the dead vines the goats had already stripped. They slowly unveiled the impossible. Built directly into the side of the deep ravine, deliberately hidden from the highway and the sky, was an entire subterranean homestead. It was a masterpiece of off-grid masonry. The front facade was built of thick, mortar-bound stone, featuring heavy oak doors that had miraculously resisted the rot of the humid south, protected by the dense canopy of vines. "I don't understand," Wyatt whispered, wiping dirt from a clouded glass window pane. "I've lived in Oconee my whole life. Nobody ever said there was a house on Track 73. The county records listed as undeveloped, raw agricultural land. That's why the county couldn't survey it." Sadie realized, her mind racing. "The brush was too thick, and this place is built into the earth. It doesn't show up on satellite imaging." Sadie pressed her shoulder against the heavy oak door. It groaned, the rusted iron hinges fighting it back, but it gave way. Inside, the air was shockingly cool, smelling of damp earth, old paper, and a faint hint of kerosene. They clicked on their flashlights. The beams cut through the gloom, revealing a time capsule. The main room was perfectly preserved. There was a cast-iron wood stove, a heavy wooden dining table, and walls lined with empty mason jars. But it was the desk in the corner that drew Sadie's eye. It was cluttered with drafting papers, old topo maps, and an inch of thick dust. Sitting dead center on the desk was a heavy, olive-green metal lockbox. Wyatt stepped up beside her. "You think it's locked?" Sadie reached out and pulled the latch. To her surprise, the hasp was undone. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were stacks of documents, a heavy leather-bound ledger, and a stack of letters tied with twine. She picked up the top document. It was a deed, stamped and notarized in 1978. The name at the top sent a chill down her spine. Leon Montgomery. Leon Montgomery was a local legend, a wealthy, eccentric civil engineer who had vanished without a trace in 1982. Rumor was he had cashed out his life savings, paranoid about the Cold War, and disappeared into the wind. But he hadn't disappeared into the wind. He had disappeared into the earth. Sadie's hands shook as she unfolded a second, more recent-looking paper tucked into the ledger. It wasn't a deed. It was a carbon copy of a legal injunction filed against Oconee County, dated just weeks before Leon's disappearance. As Sadie read the typed words, the blood drained from her face. Track 73 had never been legally forfeited for back taxes. According to this injunction, Leon had prepaid the property taxes in a blind trust for 100 years. The document accused the county, specifically a young zoning clerk named Arthur Pendleton, of illegally altering municipal records to falsely show the land in default, attempting to steal the property because it sat on the largest untapped underground aquifer in the region. "Wyatt," Sadie breathed, her eyes wide as she looked up from the paper. "The county didn't lose this land to the Kudzu. They let the Kudzu grow to hide what they did. Arthur Pendleton didn't just sell me a piece of overgrown land." She looked back down at the box, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He sold me a crime scene." The damp, cool air of the underground homestead suddenly felt suffocating. Sadie stared at the carbon copy in her trembling hands, the pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle violently snapping into place. Leon Montgomery hadn't vanished into thin air, and Track 73 wasn't an abandoned wasteland. It was a fortress protecting a multi-million-dollar water reservoir, and Arthur Pendleton had spent his entire career ensuring it stayed buried under a mountain of invasive vines until he had the power to sell it to the highest bidder. "Wyatt, we need to leave, right now," Sadie whispered, her voice tight with panic. She quickly gathered the oilcloth, carefully wrapping the ledger, the deeds, and the carbon-copied injunction back into a tight bundle. "If Arthur knows we've pushed the herd into the ravine, he knows we're close to this house. He knows what's down here." Wyatt nodded, his face pale beneath his sunburn. "My truck is parked at the south gate. We'll take the documents to my safe. But Sadie, you can't stay in that airstream tonight. If Pendleton was willing to cut a hot wire and risk a highway pileup, there's no telling what he'll do to keep a 30-year fraud quiet." "I'm not leaving my herd," Sadie said, her jaw setting into a stubborn line. She shoved the heavy bundle into Wyatt's arms. "Take this. Drive straight to Atlanta in the morning and find the State Bureau of Investigation. Skip the county sheriff entirely. Pendleton probably signs his overtime checks. I'll hold the line here." That night, a thick Georgia thunderstorm rolled over the Oconee River Basin, turning the red clay of Tract 73 into a slick, treacherous paste. Sadie sat in the dark of her Airstream, a loaded 12-gauge shotgun resting across her knees. Outside, the rain hammered against the aluminum roof, masking any sound of approaching footsteps. Barnaby, the Great Pyrenees, was stationed under the trailer's awning, his white coat stained red with mud, his deep, rumbling growls cutting through the thunder. At 2:01 a.m., Barnaby's growl erupted into a ferocious, echoing bark. Sadie kicked the trailer door open, leveling the shotgun into the torrential downpour. The beam of her heavy tactical flashlight cut through the sheets of rain. Down by the staging pens, a shadow was moving rapidly along the fence line. "Barnaby, hold!" Sadie screamed over the storm, racking the pump of the shotgun. The unmistakable cluck, cluck echoed loudly, even over the thunder. The shadow froze. The beam of Sadie's flashlight caught the silver, reflective striping of a county-issued rain slicker. It was Arthur Pendleton. He was holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters and a red plastic jerry can. He had been heading straight for the main staging paddock, where Goliath and the rest of the herd were huddled under a tarp shelter. For a second, the two locked eyes through the deluge. Arthur's face was twisted in a mixture of rage and terror. He dropped the jerry can and the bolt cutters, turned on his heel, and sprinted back toward the highway, disappearing into the blinding rain before Sadie could even shout a warning. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a steaming, humid morning. Sadie walked down to the fence line. The jerry can was still there, sitting in the mud. She unscrewed the cap and winced at the pungent chemical burn of industrial herbicide. Arthur hadn't come to cut the fence this time. He had come to poison the soil and the forage, knowing the goats would eat the tainted kudzu and die. Without her herd, Sadie would default on the 60-day code enforcement, and the county would immediately seize the land. He was desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. By day 48, Track 73 was unrecognizable. The goats had decimated the Kudzu graveyard, where once there was an impenetrable 60-foot wall of strangling vines. There were now rolling hills, ancient oaks breathing free for the first time in decades, and the deep, sprawling ravine holding Leon Montgomery's subterranean home. But Arthur wasn't done. On day 55, a convoy of county vehicles arrived. Arthur stepped out of his SUV, flanked by a deputy sheriff and a wealthy-looking man in a tailored linen suit. Richard Belmont, the commercial developer who had been quietly funding Arthur's political ambitions. Arthur held up a bright orange piece of paper. "Stop work order, Miss Gallagher," he shouted over the bleating of the goats. "I'm citing you for an unpermitted agricultural excavation and environmental disruption of a protected waterway. You have 24 hours to remove these animals, or the county will confiscate them and condemn the property." Sadie walked up to the fence line, leaning against a fiberglass post. She looked at Richard Belmont, then at Arthur. "There's no waterway on this map, Arthur," Sadie said calmly. "There's an underground aquifer, and your hoofed rats are disrupting the topsoil above it." Arthur sneered. "The land is going into receivership." "It's over, Sadie." Sadie didn't flinch. I have 5 days left on my 60-day notice to clear the highway frontage. The code says nothing about the interior of the property. You have no legal standing to issue a stop work order on private agricultural land without a judge's signature. I have the authority of the zoning board, Arthur barked, his face flushing red. He turned to the deputy. Arrest her if she interferes. We're impounding the herd. The deputy hesitated, resting his hand on his duty belt, but before he could take a step forward, the roar of a heavy diesel engine echoed down Highway 9. A sleek, black SUV with state government plates pulled off the shoulder, parking directly behind Arthur's county vehicle. The doors opened and Wyatt Jenkins stepped out, followed by 2 men wearing windbreakers that read Georgia State Bureau of Investigation. Arthur Pendleton's smug expression dissolved instantly. He took a half-step backward as the 2 state agents approached the fence line. "Arthur Pendleton?" the lead agent asked, his voice deadpan. "Yes, but I'm in the middle of a county enforcement action," Arthur stammered, pointing a shaky finger at Sadie. "This woman is operating in illegal grazing." "We don't care about the goats, Mr. Pendleton," the agent interrupted, holding up a manila folder. Sadie recognized the oilcloth bundle sticking out from the top. "We care about the blind trust of Leon Montgomery and a 1982 property tax ledger that appears to have been fraudulently altered in the county archives. A ledger that you signed off on when you were a junior clerk." Richard Belmont, the developer, took a sharp breath. He looked at Arthur, his eyes wide with sudden realization. "Arthur, what is he talking about? You told me this land was cleanly foreclosed. You told me the aquifer rights were clear." "They are. It's a lie," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "Montgomery abandoned this land. He left. Mr. Montgomery filed an injunction against you, Mr. Pendleton, 3 weeks before he disappeared," the second agent said, stepping closer. "An injunction, stating you were attempting to falsify tax records to steal the aquifer beneath Track 73. An injunction you conveniently buried in the archives. We've already cross-referenced the documents Miss Gallagher provided with the microfiche in the state capitol. You've been hiding a prime piece of real estate under a county-protected nuisance vegetation shield for 30 years, waiting for the right commercial buyer to split the profits with." The agent turned his gaze to Richard Belmont. "Are you the buyer, sir?" Belmont raised his hands, backing away toward his luxury sedan as fast as his expensive leather shoes would carry him. "I have no idea what he's talking about. I was told this was a standard municipal auction. I am entirely removed from this." Belmont practically threw himself into his car, the engine roaring to life as he abandoned Arthur on the shoulder of the highway. Arthur looked entirely defeated. He turned to Sadie, venom in his eyes. "You think you've won? The county will still condemn this land. It's a hazard." Sadie reached into the pocket of her denim jacket. She pulled out a heavy, mud-stained piece of black plastic. It was a county-issued 2-way radio. "You dropped this the night you came onto my property with a jug of industrial herbicide," Sadie said loudly, ensuring the state agents and the deputy sheriff could hear every word. "It has your badge number etched into the back. I believe that's felony trespassing, attempted destruction of agricultural property, and tampering with a water supply." The deputy sheriff, finally understanding the gravity of the situation, stepped away from Arthur and looked at the state agents, giving a stiff nod. Arthur Pendleton didn't say another word. The fight drained out of him, leaving him looking small, old, and terrified. As the state agents read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs, the goats continued to graze peacefully in the background, entirely unbothered by the dramatic collapse of a decades-long political conspiracy. Goliath trotted up to the fence line, chewing rhythmically on a thick, woody vine, and let out a loud, dismissive bleat. 2 weeks later, the 60-day deadline officially expired. Oconee County, scrambling to do damage control in the wake of Arthur Pendleton's highly publicized arrest, formally dismissed all code violations against Tract 73. The state attorney general's office stepped in to honor the late Leon Montgomery's blind trust. Because Leon had no living heirs, and because Sadie had uncovered the fraud and cleared the land, the state awarded her the surface agricultural deed free and clear, while placing the underground aquifer into a protected environmental trust that could never be tapped by commercial developers. Sadie Gallagher didn't just save her farm, she secured her future. She moved out of the rusted airstream and into the subterranean stone homestead built by Leon Montgomery. With Wyatt's help, she restored the slate roof, polished the glass windows, and brought the off-grid masterpiece back to life. The Kudzu never returned. Where the suffocating green ocean had once choked the life out of Tract 73, there was now rolling pasture, dotted with wildflowers and native Georgia grasses, and reigning over it all was an army of 150 happy, well-fed goats who had eaten their way through a monster to uncover a miracle. What started as a desperate gamble against the vine that ate the South turned into the greatest agricultural victory Oconee County had ever seen. Sadie's goats didn't just clear the land. They chewed through 30 years of political corruption and unearthed a forgotten legacy. If you loved this incredible, true-to-life farming story of grit, goats, and justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing homesteading dramas.